A lot of people ask me about my last name, de Cordova, and they're not familiar with it. They said, well, where are you from? And I said, usually I say, well, Jamaica. Jamaican? I said, yeah, my third great-grandfather, Jacob de Cordova, was born in Jamaica. Actually, his family, the best that we understand, were purged from Spain in the late 1500s during the Inquisition. Large groups of the Jews that chose to flee went to Constantinople, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. They were actually treated better under the Muslim rulers than they were under the Catholic monarchs. The documentation takes us back there into the late 1500s in Constantinople. And Jacob de Cordova, who's my third great-grandfather's fourth great-grandfather, was actually born in Constantinople, or present-day Turkey. They stayed there for a couple of generations. We don't know much about what they did during that time period, but they did leave Constantinople and ended up in Amsterdam, which was, it had two things going for it. One, it was religiously tolerant as opposed to some other European countries, and also they wanted and liked merchants and people who were industrious and engaged in various productive trades. I mean, the Dutch were about making money. So Jacob's family settled in Amsterdam, and they were printers of Hebrew manuscripts and books, also in Portuguese and Spanish. Jacob was born in Spanish Town in 1808. And at the time, Spanish Town was the capital of the British colony. It was under British control at that point. His mother died in childbirth with him. And his father sent Jacob off to England. His mother was English, by the way, English Jew, to England for his education, and probably because he couldn't take care of the young boy. Also, obviously, England was a little bit more civilized than Jamaica at the time. It was a pretty rough place. And so Jacob was raised into his teenage years in England. By that time, his father, who was a coffee merchant and exporter, had relocated to Philadelphia. And I was thinking, to put things in historical context, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were still alive. We're talking just a couple of decades after the American independence and the U.S. Constitution was enacted. Sure, there was a lot of activity there for him, and he set up shop there and was importing goods from Jamaica into Philadelphia. I think, and a lot of this has to do with Jacob's Jewish, lineage and his roots. His father was one of the charter members of the first and the oldest synagogue in Philadelphia in 1824. Prior to it becoming a chartered synagogue in 1820, he served as the president of that synagogue. So Jacob joined him as a teenager in Philadelphia, and that's where he met his future wife, Rebecca Sterling, who was not Jewish. She was Presbyterian. And Jacob and Rebecca were married in a Presbyterian ceremony in 1829. We understand that he was having a bit of some health issues in Philadelphia. We understand that the winters were probably pretty harsh. He was born, in a subtropical climate, but did spend time in England. We understand that the doctor told him that he would probably be better off health-wise if he returned home into a warmer climate. So he did go back to Jamaica with his wife around 1833 and founded a newspaper called the Gleaner. And that newspaper is still in operation and circulation over 180 years later. Jacob did have some printing in his blood, dating back a couple of hundred years to Amsterdam. Whether or not, he even knew that, I don't know. I don't know. But publishing and printing and writing were certainly in his blood, in which he picked up later and brought into Texas as well. But he left Jamaica in 1834 and left the newspaper in the hands of Joshua, one of his brothers. And he arrived in New Orleans first and set up shop there, basically as a merchant and trader, sending staples into the Texas before and right after the Texas independence. And they were in desperate needs of supplies. And so that was his first business venture. After that, he relocated to Galveston. Most of the items that were coming into Texas were coming out of New Orleans into Galveston anyway, and so I think he wanted to be a little bit closer to the action. So it was shortly after independence, around 1839, I believe, that he relocated his family to Galveston. He had a couple of kids by that point in time, and so he became a citizen of the Republic of Texas around 1839. Houston was just getting started, and again, I think maybe he wanted to be a little bit closer to the action, and so moved from Galveston after just a couple of years to Houston, where he opened his first land business. Engaged in the trading business for a while, but Texas was now a republic, and it was time to start moving settlers in. And so I think he saw an opportunity there. Jacob stayed in Houston. Like I said, that's where he started his first, the Cordova Land Agency in 1845. That was kind of the year of its official opening date. And his brother Phineas, who had been born in Philadelphia, but was back in Jamaica, joined him in 1847. And kind of set up the Austin-based operations of the land agency. In 1840, he was a group of 15 businessmen who met and formed the Houston Chamber of Commerce. Also, he was elected to the Houston City Council twice. He was also elected to the Texas legislature from the second Texas legislature. Roads were pretty primitive to non-existent. It was either buggy or horseback, and Texas is a big place to travel by horseback. He managed to do it and ride most of known Texas at the time. He saw firsthand, and also surveyed quite a bit of it. That's something some people don't know. I mean, yeah, he hired surveyors. I mean, you had to. Texas is just too vast to do it yourself, but he did a lot of surveying himself. In the 1840s, there was a very small wave of Jewish immigration into Houston. We're talking a handful of Jewish families. Jacob obviously knew them, became involved with them, and was able to put together the 10 necessary men to recite the Jewish prayers so they could actually begin having Jewish worship services. That group of men became the first synagogue in Houston, Beth Israel, which is still in existence today. Jacob did move his family to Austin for a short period, then to a home that he built outside of Seguin, about 5 miles outside of Seguin. And he called it Wanderer's Retreat. He loved that part of the country. In 1849, a huge portion of the land, what constitutes this core part of Waco, was owned by a New Yorker, Judge Chambers, and he was a big investor in Texas land. Jacob had traveled quite a bit to New York. He became friends with Judge Chambers. And I'm sure there were discussions about what to do with his land. Chambers sold that land to a gentleman, land speculator in Galveston, Snydor. got involved with Snyder. It's clear that Jacob visited this site probably quite often. He called it one of the most beautiful places for a city in Texas. Jacob was so fond of the location and the thought of a city. He called Waco his going to be my daughter, and a beautiful daughter it's going to be. So he hired George Arath, who was also a friend of his, who did a lot of surveying for Jacob, to survey and to lay out the initial town site for the city of Waco in 1849. In 1850, they were looking for a county seat for the newly formed McLennan County, and Jacob lobbied for Waco to be the county seat of McLennan County. And as part of that, donated some tracts, very important tracts of land for that to take place, which includes some of the plots of land that would be used for the governmental offices as well. Evidently, his wife Rebecca was of the Christian faith. All of the five children, the 2 girls and the 3 boys, were all raised in the Christian faith. That didn't seem to be problematic with Jacob at all. Rebecca encouraged Jacob, maybe insisted, that he also provide land for each denomination, Christian denomination, and I understand that was done. Jacob also encouraged Shapley Ross to move to Waco and to start the ferry service on the Brazos River. It's also our understanding too that he gave some business concessions and also some land to some other business to try to get the economic engine of Waco running as well. He ended up after Austin for a few years. He did build another Wanderers Retreat. There was a town there. It's now a ghost town called Kimball. The land agency that his brother helped run from Austin, Texas is a big state, was the largest that ever operated in the southwest part of the United States. And at its peak, Jacob and/or the agency owned and controlled over 1 million acres of central Texas. Personally, Jacob owned land in 46 counties. He died without a will. It took nearly 15 years to unravel his estate and the land holdings. In 1849, he published what was still considered to be the first, most important, accurate map of Texas. I find it fascinating too, the map has little partial triangles, little groups of them, which were the Indian tribes that were still in the existence in Texas at the time that he rode. The map was praised by Sam Houston on the floor of the U.S. Senate and signed by Rusk and several other prominent Texans. It's a very rare map. The 1849 edition, there are only like 6 known that survived. And the Texas General Land Office has one of them. Very, very highly prized by collectors. 2 of Jacob's sons did fight in the Civil War for Texas on the Confederacy, and there were some other family members fighting on the Union side as well. Texas was starting to grow a lot of cotton. They didn't have the manufacturing facilities. It was difficult during the Civil War, the blockades, to get Texas cotton out to England for manufacturing. And so after the Civil War, he had conceived this plan to start building a series of dams on the Brazos River and to start putting in some textile mills so that Texas could start doing its own processing and manufacturing of its cotton. During the Civil War period also, he had his land, obviously the land business slowed down, and he did have some financial distress. And one of the reasons was, he said, you know, I brought a lot of these settlers to Texas. I sold them the land. I financed the land. I can't throw them off of the land. He chose to take the hit rather than to kick the young immigrants off the land. I think that says something about the man's character as well. Because of his extensive land holdings and business dealings in Texas leading up and during the Civil War, he was considered a traitor to the United States and was put on that list. And in 1865, after the Civil War, he applied to, Lincoln had been assassinated, he applied to President Andrew Johnson for pardon, which he received in December of 1865. He spoke Hebrew, Spanish, French, German, and English, which certainly helped him communicate with the various immigrant and several Indian dialects, some of the immigrants that were coming to Texas. He wasn't your typical rough and tumble frontiersman, with the coonskin hat and rifle. He was a pretty sophisticated, very well educated man of the world at that time. And when you think about the amount of traveling he did, he commuted by ship, sailing ship from New Orleans and Jamaica multiple times to Philadelphia, to New York, to England. Those were not easy trips. And I think one of the reasons maybe his kids were all raised in the Christian faith, I don't think he was home very much. How could he have been? Riding Texas on horseback? Several of the adventures, and he talks about them in his lecture. He did bring his wife and a young son on some of these Texas adventures, and he talks about them coming very close to being attacked by a group of Cherokees. He would have, I think, been quite a sight riding up on horseback. He was not a land speculator in that sense. I mean, he did the work, he did the footwork, and I just can't personally imagine surveying and personally seeing and riding as much of Texas as he did, and recording all of that. Must have been a monumental undertaking. Jacob was not a slave owner. He seemed to be somewhat apolitical. He just kind of wanted what was best for Texas. He was well known. I think if he had some public opinions that we would have read about some of those. Jacob and his brothers qualified the Cordova family for entry into Malcolm Stern's The First 600 American Jewish Families. Okay. So the roots from that stem are very, very deep in the United States. Jacob had proposed the name Lamartine after Melville Lamar, President Lamar, as the city name. And evidently, I've seen various stories of this. He said, "I'm not doing it if you're going to name it that. I'm not going to survey it." The other was that he was just successfully persuaded, and thank goodness for Wacoans today, to stick with Waco after the Waco Indian village. So that was probably a good choice. Jacob had become associated, we're not quite sure, either in England or in New Orleans with the fraternal organization known as the OddFellows. And Jacob, while he was in New Orleans, he was a deputy grand sire in Louisiana of the OddFellows. But in 1848, he secured the charter for an Oddfellows Lodge, Lone Star No. 1 in Houston, Texas, which was the first Oddfellows Lodge outside the United States. And he was named the Deputy Grand Sire of Texas for that fraternal organization. It was about taking care of the sick, poor, and needy. It really was a true fraternal organization devoted to public service. And Jacob and his wife were buried in an old cemetery in Kimball. And there was an act of the Texas legislature to have him and his wife, with the family's permission, to have their remains disinterred and reinterred on the public hill at the state cemetery. In 1986, there was a small historical marker down at Indian Springs Park that finally recognized his part of Waco history. And there was a small gathering of some of his descendants. He wasn't in Texas for about a little over 30 years. When you look about what he was able to accomplish in 30 years, to say he was a go-getter was probably, that's an understatement. He loved Texas. Texas was his life, and Waco was his daughter.